Welcome back to the show. For those of you just tuning in, or for those who haven't heard about this show before, a little background on John. He has been practicing law for over 30 years. He's been a partner in a law firm. He's been in the corporate general counsel. He's been the chief deputy. He's been the attorney general for the state of Utah. What else has he done? So many things. John, I actually have a question for you.
You bet.
What is the difference between the chief deputy and the attorney general? Because I feel like they're kind of like, in my mind, I've heard those words all kind of mushed together. Like, can you give us a little insight?
Sure. Well, the Attorney General in most states is an elected office. It's the chief legal officer of the state of Utah, responsible for the policy of the state, the legal policy of the state, has a lot of meetings with the governor's office and the legislature as they consider various policies, and really is the final say. The buck stops, so they say, with the Attorney General's decision, whether it's in policy matters, legislative matters, even governor policies, or in litigation for the state. So the Attorney General has the final word to settle a case for the state or to prosecute or sue on behalf of the state. So every pleading, which is a court document, which has the state as a party or the plaintiff or defendant, will have the name of the Attorney General. The chief deputy, on the other hand, is the person who really runs the legal department of the state of Utah. So I kind of say, I guess tongue-in-cheek, that I was the general counsel for the state of Utah and all of its legal affairs on the civil side, which are the litigation, the lawsuits, and those kinds of things, not the prosecution side, for 3 years before I became the attorney general. Most attorneys general are more of the political type. It's rare to have an attorney general who's had both the experience running the legal department of the state and the hundreds of attorneys that we have and the many divisions of the state, and to be elected the attorney general. I'm one of the few who's had both experiences.
You are part of the handful, and that's amazing. And that's why everyone listening today should be so excited for this topic, because John has had so many different experiences with law, ranging from personal injury all the way to high-level court cases. But today, John, we are going to be talking about a topic that is ramping up and not even becoming more of an issue in our day, but it has become very relevant, and that is divorce.
Right. Divorce is, early in my career especially, as a partner in a law firm, I did have a family practice and saw some terrible things, even in my office. I remember one time when I was a very, very young lawyer, and a couple came in to talk to me about a divorce, and the husband got very upset with his wife and actually was physically abusive to her right in front of me. And I actually had to call the police. I wanted to deck the guy, honestly. But I had a house, I had a family, and I didn't want to lose everything I had by creating an assault, right? So I actually had to call the police, and it was very, very difficult and emotional. Divorce, domestic law, separation of relationships, it is always an emotional issue, and it's a very important time in any person's life. And so I'm really interested and willing to talk about the do's and don'ts, what you can do to protect yourself if you're in a situation where you have to make that very, very difficult decision to leave someone that you've bonded with, that you've raised a family with, that you've made promises with, and actually go into a separate area of your life and leave that person permanently. That's divorce law, that's domestic law, and that's family law. And I'm happy to talk about that and share whatever insight I can on the topic.
Beautiful. Awesome. Well, I think you've kind of touched on it already, but what is the definition of divorce, and on what grounds can a divorce be filed? Because I know you can't most of the time you just can't willy-nilly just go in and say, hey, I just want to split up like that. Like it's not easy as just tearing a piece of paper, right?
Right. And so every state has an interest. The state, as you understand, kind of the hierarchy of political subdivisions. My philosophy is that the federal government was founded by the states, the 13 colonies, who ratified a constitution for a federal government. And then the state governments, they create political subdivisions like counties and cities. But the policy relating to matters like family law and what a family is and divorce all comes from the state legislature. And so every state has a separate process. They're very similar state to state for a divorce, for what a marriage is and what a divorce is. So anytime a couple that has a formal marriage that's through a marriage certificate, and they are married, and then they live together, and then they create a family together, and they put their finances together into a common pool and live together as a couple, as a unit, then when they separate that, the state has laws that dictate how that all occurs. And typically it starts with the filing of a petition for a divorce. And then there's a statutory, sequence of things that need to be alleged to talk about when you were married, how long you've been married, where you resided during the marriage, making sure the court that you're applying to has the jurisdiction to dissolve the marriage. Many times there are assets that are involved, which are very sensitive between the parties. There are children, and that's where probably the hardest part of a divorce comes into play, is decisions about minor children and where they're going to live and who's going to take care of them and what kind of support they're going to need from each of the parties as they move forward. And so many of the laws of the state dealing with divorce are very specific about how each of those areas, financial, custody, visitation, and all of those things are handled between the parties as they sever the family and go their separate ways and deal with important issues. And those are all governed by statute and by rules and regulations.
Gotcha. So if someone out there is listening today and they kind of don't know where to start, like first steps, like what's the first thing you need to do when wanting to file for a divorce? Like, are there different things, like a checklist that needs to be checked, like, oh, like they did this or they did that, like this is why we need to go to the law, this is why we need to get involved to be able to file for a divorce?
Right. And so in some cases, maybe even as many as half the cases, a husband and a wife will talk about getting a divorce beforehand, and they will talk about the children, and they'll talk about their assets. Then they'll try to come up with what they think is fair in terms of division of the assets, the home and the bank accounts and the retirement accounts and the cars and any other assets that they have, and try to create lists of things that they each agree that the other person can keep. And that's a very important process for anyone to go through in divorce, because at the end of the day, if the parties can agree to things, it's always a lot more amicable, and people leave the situation, a bad situation, better than if they have to have some independent person like a mediator make suggestions, or a judge actually consider the evidence, weigh the interests of the parties, weigh the interests of the children, and come up with a decision. In many cases, a couple will say, let's agree to how the children will be taken care of and who they will live with most of the time, and what the visitation schedule will be like, whether it's like what the state suggests as a standard visitation schedule, or whether the parties want to do something that's more lenient to one side than the state would require, is really between those parties. I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that if you don't understand your rights and feel like you have an even weight in this decision process as you're negotiating with your soon-to-be former spouse, you really need competent legal counsel with experience who will pay attention to your case and not treat you just as if you were one of 1,000 cases sitting on their desk, and really listen to you, advise you, give you the counsel that you need, and then help take care of your situation as you end your divorce. Because let's just be honest, people can take advantage of the other partner in a divorce. People can promise one thing and then the documents will come back totally different. A person can secretly counsel with an attorney on the side and have an unfair bargaining position against the person who's not represented. And my goal here is not to say, let's just go off and hire any lawyer we can find and let's always make this kind of really adversarial. But the bottom line is, if you don't know your rights and if you're not in a position to exercise your rights, if you don't understand what your options really are, if you don't understand that your spouse may be playing you in some way, then you're really at a serious disadvantage in one of the most important decisions and one of the most important frameworks that can affect your future financial security, or whether or not and to what extent you have a relationship with your children. And so it's really one of those 2 or 3 things in your life that if you're ever going to need help, you definitely need help when you're going through something as serious as a divorce. So the first thing, I would definitely recommend you talk to a very good lawyer and look for one if you don't have a relationship with a lawyer. And how do you find the right lawyer? Well, some people will network with their friends. Maybe a person who has a friend who's gone through a divorce and maybe has someone that they really thought highly of that really helped them when they went through their process. And you can talk to that person. That person may say, whatever you do, don't talk to the person I talked with because he didn't or she didn't help me at all. And so you can find lawyers with word of mouth. You can go on the internet and look someone up, or you can try to find a lawyer that you trust and ask questions. And that person, if that person doesn't practice in that specialty area, sometimes can recommend someone that they really trust that you'd be in good hands with if you chose that person. First thing, make sure you find the right help.
Perfect. Awesome. Another question that I think some people might ask, and that just doing some research, that was a question that was around, is does it matter who files first in a divorce case? And when you do file for a divorce, how long does the process take? I feel like people really need to know kind of what the timeline is and what the certain order things need to go in. So just like you said, first step is finding the right help, but then next, is it a rat race to try to see who files first, or what does that kind of look like, John?
Well, I think that there's always an emotional edge if you feel like you took the first stab at what the situation is. But in most states, they have what are called no-fault divorces, where it doesn't really matter why you're getting divorced. What really matters is that you've decided that there are irreconcilable differences, and you just simply want to separate. So there's not nearly as much of a focus on the circumstances, causing the divorce, although there can be. Some states have laws where if there's unfaithfulness, that becomes a matter that the court can consider. Certainly where there's abuse in the marriage, that can certainly weigh in terms of decisions the judge may make, or especially relative to asset division or child custody matters, because the courts in every state, are interested in what's best for the children. And so if you have a situation in your divorce where one side is acting in a way that would be very harmful for the children, for example, then that can be pled in the pleading documents that are filed with the court. But whether you go first or second isn't nearly as important as making sure that you get it right with the right counsel to move forward with. I will say that if you're not careful, or if you're asleep at the wheel, you can be taken advantage of in a divorce by your spouse, and so it is important to engage that lawyer. And one of the things about engaging that lawyer is resources. And so one of the things that is very important is that as you are preparing to file, you need to make sure that you have the resources set aside to pay for good legal help that will respond to your phone calls and respond to your email questions and vigorously represent your side. That one of the biggest complaints I think about the domestic practice is that that lawyers sometimes won't do the heavy lifting that they need to do to make sure that your interests are really protected. And so finding the right lawyer and having some resources set aside, some money to pay a good lawyer, is very, 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 very important.
It's always good, and I feel like that is just a common thing in all of what you teach us, John, is like it's always better to be prepared for these type of situations. It's always good to know who you need to talk to and what lawyer is going to be able to help you in these cases. Talking a little bit more about that, another question that has come up is, do you actually need to go to court if you want to file for a divorce? Is there any other options? Well,
no, really. A divorce by state law, I don't think there's an exception in any jurisdiction, needs to be finalized and recognized by the government. And so that requires some type of filing with the court. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that lawyers per se need to be involved. And a lot of states have done a lot of things to add to the self-help ability for people to interface with the legal system, with the courts on their own without the need to have a lawyer. But again, if I always say this about whether or not to hire a lawyer, and it's kind of like the same thing you'd use if you went to, made a decision about whether to see a doctor. If you got a little scratch on your arm and you've got a little bit of alcohol or something you can put on, clean the wound, and it's not a serious cut, you probably don't need to go to the emergency room. You can make a decision about what you do, right? And treat yourself. But if it's a very serious injury, a broken arm, or if you're bleeding profusely from a cut on your head or something, you probably want to go get it taken care of with a professional. And it's the same with law. If it's something serious, you're going to want to not just kind of handle it on yourself. And so if you and your husband are clear on what your rights are, or you and your wife are pretty clear about where the children should end up, and you think you can work things out, you may not need a lawyer to help you through the divorce. But in most cases, it's one of those things, one of those 4 or 5 things that will ever happen to you in your life that's serious enough to get real professional help to make sure that you're getting everything right. And let me just add to that. Early in my career, I was handling a divorce for a really nice woman, and she spent like 5 minutes telling me what a great relationship she had with her in-laws, and how she was sure would recognize that her husband had real problems, and that when push came to shove with the children or with the finances, they would be on her side. And of course, with my experience, I felt very differently. And it wasn't surprising to me when, after the lawsuit, the divorce complaint was served on the other side, the in-laws became very upset at her. They weren't her friend. They weren't friends with her anymore, and they weren't cooperative like she thought they would be. And so my advice to people is that you have to be careful and understand that when you sever that relationship with a spouse, in most cases, the family of the spouse are going to be very protective of their own side of the family. And so when you're separating and you're divorcing, you're really divorcing not just your spouse, but their family as well. And so be careful and not misjudge how emotional and how divisive the situation will become. And that's why it's good to have a friend. And when I say friend, I don't just necessarily mean your friends, but I mean a professional friend like a lawyer that you can confide in, talk to, strategize with, and just make sure things are done in a way to send all the right signals to make sure there's fairness in the process. And that comes from the right lawyer.
So it is probably a resounding yes for this next question, but both parties should have a lawyer, correct? And it's smart and intelligent to have one, just so everything is covered, and also, like you said, you need to have the right lawyer. You need to have a good lawyer who has your best interests in mind.
The way the system works is it's called an adversarial system for a reason. And the lawyer that you engage has one role and one role only, and that is to zealously advocate your position according to your directions, and to be loyal to you and you only in the process, the law and you, right? So if you have one side with a lawyer who's zealously advocating for his or her client's position, and then you're standing there alone without a lawyer on your side, then you're going up not only against your spouse, but also the lawyer who is expert, who knows the law, and whose job it is to skew things to his client's or her client's favor. And so what you're doing is you're throwing what otherwise would be an equal, I don't want to call it a fight, but an equal process to a very unbalanced process. And so and a lawyer in a divorce case really can't represent both sides. There's an inherent conflict of interest in that situation. The lawyer can't protect the confidentiality of both sides at the same time. The lawyer is duty bound through professional ethics to represent zealously his or her client, not clients. And they can't, by rule, professional obligation, equally represent both sides. So don't fall into that trap. If your spouse is going to engage with a lawyer, you will never be in balance unless you engage with a lawyer who is zealously advocating on your side. And then the way it's supposed to work, things come together in the middle. Without exception, if you're thinking that you guys can work things out while he has a lawyer or while she has a lawyer and that things will end up fair, you're misjudging the situation. And I'm not trying to create a sense that it always has to be adversarial. It doesn't have to necessarily be adversarial, but every party would be well advised to understand what the pressure points are and what their legal rights are and what they're really entitled to from their own confidant. And then once you've reached out to a lawyer and you understand what those are, then you can limit the interactions. You can limit the cost by at least being informed, so that if you had a lawyer, for example, that you wanted to not do everything for you because you just couldn't afford all the help to go all the way, it would be easy to engage a lawyer to review what the other side has put together and let you know how they feel about how fair it is or how unfair it is and give you talking points to negotiate. So you don't have to necessarily have your lawyer do all the work and spend all the money they might otherwise spend, but you certainly need to be advised and make sure that you understand what your options are, so that as you go into that resolution conference or negotiation, you are fairly represented and you really know what your rights are and not trusting of the other side and what they tell you. Unfortunately, that's kind of how it works. Unfortunately, when there's enough bad blood between you that you feel like you have to get divorced, there's enough of an edge or ego involved to where sometimes people get a lot of satisfaction from taking advantage of the other side. And that's because divorce is so emotional. Like what happened in my office when I was a very young lawyer, when the man lost his cool and struck his wife in front of me. He was terribly wrong to have done that. And it was terribly hard for him to control his emotions. It was so personal.
And I think you answering all these questions have really helped a lot of the audience today, if not the audience themselves, people that they know. Going into this last question is, what happens to children? What happens to the house? What happens to the assets or the money? What does that look like when going through a divorce and filing a divorce? And what does the support look like, either on the lawyer's end or wherever? What does that kind of look like? How do people come out the other end without kind of bleeding out, if you say?
Well, when you figure that one out, let me know, because honestly, domestic divorce is when I say domestic, it's called domestic law or home law or divorce, right? It's one of the most excruciating things in the world. The best thing in the world would be if people always got along, if couples who made the commitment to be married made the sacrifices, stay together, love each other, and live in harmony with each other, and it's best for the children. When that can't happen, and it seems like more and more it's getting to that point, the state has an interest. The judges have an interest, and they're instructed by almost every legislature to act in what's called the best interests of the children. And typically, you'll see when there's a dispute about custody, you'll see the engagement of an expert who will come and do a custody evaluation. They'll analyze the home situation on both sides, the relationship of the children with both parties, the dependency of the children on one parent versus the other, the typical roles of the parent in the relationship with the children, and they'll come back to the court these people have to be paid, and the costs are usually split between the parties, and they'll make a recommendation to the court about where the children should be, and really give an analysis of that for the judge if the parties can't decide on their own where the children should live. Okay, a lot of it's very structured in many states. In Utah, where I have practiced for 30 years, it's very detailed about how that whole process works, and the time and the visitation and everything else that happens. But again, it comes down to what the state is informed of, not by the parties themselves, but by an independent evaluator about what is best for the children. And so that process can take a long time. And so what usually happens when you file a case, you'll make a motion for temporary orders, and the judge will have to make a pretty quick decision early on about where the children reside during the pendency of that evaluation process, which can take up to 6 months to a year, depending on how busy the caseload is and the circumstances, right? And then the judge will then consider that as he or she makes a final decision about these custody matters. So I don't know if that answers your question, but the entire process is very complicated when it comes to children, and sometimes even when it comes to assets, because every state has different laws. Like there are some states that are that have laws which basically say that all the property of the parties is community property, which means it's everyone's property. And that's why you see in some states there's a big emphasis on prenuptial agreements to protect the assets of the party coming into the marriage who has more assets than the other party that comes into the marriage. Other states have laws that say, the separate assets of the parties when they came into the marriage are theirs. They don't merge as community property, but anything that you increase in your property during the course of the marriage until the divorce becomes final is equally owned by both spouses. And there are alimony provisions. Alimony is to compensate one party for a lack of income that party enjoyed, and the courts try to put both parties in as close to the same position financially as they were in before the marriage broke up. So there's alimony, there are child support payments, which are usually based on a schedule of income, the number of children, and how long the children stay with each spouse. In other words, it's a very complicated, very rigid process for getting through alimony, child support, child custody, and the division of marital assets. And all of those things, because they're complicated, many times require the advice of an attorney who understands how that works and how judges and courts perceive the legislation that dictates that. And so when you try to figure it out yourself, usually one side gets taken advantage of. And that adds a lot of hurt and disappointment and unfairness to a very terrible situation in the first place. I don't know if that's responsive, but it's complicated. What you've asked me is a very complicated question. And I hope that the listeners, I hope you can understand and appreciate that divorce law and the process of divorce is not a simple or an easy process and requires real professional help if you're going to level the playing field and give yourself a chance to really survive it.
Yeah, so just echoing John, really, if you need help going through this process, you need the right legal help. And John, is there a place that any listeners or any listeners' friends can go to kind of get more resources on how to kind of move forward with something like this?
Well, again, one of the reasons why we're doing this podcast is to give information to people so that they can understand better when they might need help and then where to go for that help, whether it's a neighbor or a friend for a referral. I'm always happy to have people go to my website, askjohnswallow.com, and share what it is that you're struggling with, what your question is. And even though this isn't designed to give you legal advice in terms of representation advice, to actually receive legal advice that deals with your specific issue, you need to develop an attorney-client relationship with your lawyer. So this is not intended to give you legal advice per se that you can take to the bank. But if you have a question, I'd be very interested in understanding what that is and how I can help. And you just simply go to www.askjohnswallow.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John, for your time today. I know that this is a very, very complicated situation, and this might spark up future podcast topics, but thank you so much for your insight, and please feel free to visit that website, and thank you again for your time.
You're more than welcome. Thank you.